bookish friends, you are in for such a treat today. As you know, Tea Tales and Tomes, your favorite gentle bookish podcast, has temporarily transformed into Tea Tales and Test Tubes as we celebrate the wonderful intersection of science and books. And today's guest couldn't be a more perfect fit. I had the absolute pleasure of chatting with award-winning children's author Elizabeth Shreeve ahead of the release of her new middle-grade nonfiction book, Dinosaurs To Dragons. It's a fascinating exploration of where science and mythology meet, uncovering the surprising connections between fossils, ancient discoveries, and the legendary creatures that have captured our imaginations for centuries, from mermaids and griffins to, of course, dragons. Elizabeth has this remarkable gift for making huge scientific ideas feel really accessible, really beautiful, and full of wonder. Drawing on her love of science, storytelling, and art, she creates narrative nonfiction that invites children and adults to see the natural world with fresh eyes. Her books don't simply teach science, they remind us why we fell in love with asking questions in the first place. Now, before we dive into the interview, I want you to listen out for a few ideas that weave their way through our conversation because they echo so much of what we've been exploring through this Tea Tales and Test Tube series. At one point, Elizabeth says, science is an invitation, not a judgment. She also reminds us that science is a process. It's not a set of facts. And perhaps my favorite thought of all is you cannot use science as a hammer. It is meant to inspire. I found myself smiling as we talked because, without even planning it, Elizabeth beautifully reinforced so many of the themes we've been exploring over the past few weeks and days. That science isn't about having all the answers. It's about curiosity, wonder, careful observation, and having the courage to keep asking questions. And one more thing before we begin. Elizabeth is, at the heart, one of us, a true book dragon. Throughout our conversation, she shares brilliant book recommendations, podcasts, websites, and resources. I've linked every one of them in the show notes, so there's no need to scramble for a pen. All you do need to do is pour yourself a cup of tea or coffee, settle into your favorite reading chair, and enjoy my conversation with the wonderful Elizabeth Shreeve. Hi, Elizabeth, and welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here.
I have so been looking forward to our chat. I mean, I alluded to it just now when we just were chatting. You know, you actually sit right at that intersection of what Tea Tales and Tomes is all about, which is beautiful children's literature, science, and of course, storytelling. So thank you so much for taking this time to chat to us.
Oh, it's a pleasure. And your term that you use, book dragons, just hooked me. I thought, oh my gosh, that's it. That's it.
Yes. So before we dive into your wonderful new book, which I got a little bit of a preview of, thanks to you, Dinosaurs to Dragons, I have to indulge my inner science nerd for a moment. I read that you studied under Stephen Jay Gould and E.O. Wilson. Now, I have to tell you a little story. So in my first year of university, I actually discovered Life's Grandeur, which is one of Stephen Jay Gould's books, as you will know. I think it's published under a different title in the US, and it completely changed the way that I thought about science. It was actually one of the reasons I chose microbiology as one of my undergrad majors. And I just fell in love with scientific inquiry because of this one book. In fact, my copy of Life's Grandeur is just littered with post-it notes and passages that I just want to keep going back to. So what was it like learning from brilliant scientists who've had such a profound influence on how so many people think about evolution and animal behavior and just about science in general?
Well, honestly, I was 18, 19, 20. I was so young that I really had no clue. And I wish I could go back and talk to them now. And with what I know and what I know about their work, because I know that I was friendly with Steve Gould because he asked me to house sit for him one summer. So, it's kind of funny because I did study geology. My major is in geology, although I snuck off to art classes whenever I possibly could. But I did not become a scientist. I don't consider myself a scientist. I consider myself a student of science. And Steve was always telling me not to take so many science classes. Like, don't load up on, plate tectonics or whatever. He was a very much of a Renaissance thinker, and he was constantly encouraging me to take, say music theory or history, or he was a real wide thinker. And
Wow.
that's part of his brilliance. His mind could synthesize ideas from different disciplines and put them together in his columns that he wrote for Natural History magazine for years, He did that. He brought this kind of unique perspective that was multidisciplinary to his writing. But at the time, I didn't realize he was a genius. I just thought he was my advisor and telling me, okay, so I won't take a physics class. I'll take art history. And maybe he knew that I wasn't really a scientist at heart. I don't know. But I certainly learned from him, and I did take care of his cats and his house one summer. So that's my claim to fame, is that I house sat for Stephen Jay Gould. And then at the time, he and E.O. Wilson had a great rivalry going. And Steve was a socialist at heart. His parents were kind of very, very left-wing socialist types. And E.O. Wilson was more of a proper gentleman from the South, and they had different views about sociobiology and so forth. So they didn't really see eye to eye, and they were in competition in the biology community. But then E.O. Wilson's biology classes were truly inspirational. You just go there and you just get this flood of incredible information, and you love the world. You love the living world after you go to his lectures.
That's so amazing. And it's so interesting that you say that about, seeking a multidisciplinary approach, because I also recall, in fact, one of my favorite lecturers, Dr. Lambiris, all these years ago, I still remember him encouraging us to go into the arts and even go learn linguistics if we have to, because I think, getting a well-rounded view is so important for scientific thinking. And I love that you say that Stephen Jay Gould was that way as well.
Yeah.
And also I have to beg to differ when you say that your claim to fame is that you house sit for Stephen Jay Gould, because you've got all of these remarkable books under your belt. And I think, you deserve the fame in its own right, just for yourself, for Elizabeth Shreeve, because they're simply remarkable.
Oh, you're very kind. Thank you.
Just for the listeners, do you want to tell, you kind of hinted at it, your academic background and your house sitting, but do you want to tell us a bit more about your background? Anything you want to share with the listeners, where you're from, or your particular area of expertise, your family, anything really?
Sure. So I grew up on the South Shore of Long Island, about 70 miles east of New York City, in a very science-oriented community. My father was a medical research scientist at Brookhaven Lab, and my mother had been a bacteriologist during World War II, when women, stepped up and took those jobs. And she was the first, certainly in her family, first woman to ever go to graduate school, that's for sure, in science.
Wow.
So, and she was also an artist. So she had those kind of art, science, and she was a fantastic reader, and we shared books. And my father also loved to write. He, though a very serious scientist, he would also encourage us to write and to speak clearly. He would always say, enunciate, be clear with your words, So there was always that emphasis on science and also on writing and art in the household. In the community, we were the labbies, right? The kids whose fathers were at the lab, mostly fathers at that time. But I then came under the influence of an amazing biology teacher in high school, Art Cooley, and another scientist in the community, Dennis Pulston, who were co-founders of the Environmental Defense Fund. And they were some of the first people to realize that DDT was killing osprey and other marine birds. And they launched lawsuits to stop the overuse of DDT. So we have them to thank for really saving those wonderful seabirds.
That's fascinating.
Yeah. And they took us on birding trips all over the place. We were 14, 15, and we get up at 4 a.m. and go birding. So later on, I asked Art, like, how did you do that? How did you get a teenager to wake up? And he said, yeah, you're all flirting with each other. So it's a lot of fun. So then I thought, like, to be smart, you had to be a scientist. So I went to college, and I was always a writer, and I think my writing really got me into Harvard. And I went there and thought, well, I got a major in science because that means, we do science. And the geology department was where I found the most gemütlich, kind of people who like to go outside and bang on rocks with hammers and have a good time, because the biology department, everybody seemed really intent about going to medical school. So I became a geology major and just took lots and lots of art classes, studio art and art history. And then I thought, what am I going to do with my life? And I decided to focus on landscape architecture as a kind of way to put earth science, life science, and art and design together. So I worked for a couple of years, and then I went back to the graduate school design at Harvard and got a master's in landscape architecture, and then got a job back out in California, and where I had been between college and grad school. And I stayed with that firm, SWA Group, for about 35 years. And I worked mostly as an urban planner, urban designer, working on campus plans and urban redevelopment plans, community design, doing a lot of public outreach, doing a lot of writing for the firm. Meanwhile, got married, raised 3 sons, and read books to them quite a bit. Lots and lots and lots of reading. They were very bookish boys, which was a great joy.
I love that.
Yeah. And your kids are 6 and 9 years old. Is that what I heard in the podcast? Great age for reading. So when my kids were about 6 and 9, my younger two, we read every morning. And one morning we were snuggled together reading books, big stack of books from the library. And I said, we could write a better book than this. This is not a very good book. And I sat down and I wrote a book. And it eventually was picked up by Simon & Schuster as a 4-book chapter book series. And those are my first books. So that's how I got into writing.
Wow. I love how your path has gone in so many directions, especially the whole idea of landscape architecture and urban planning, using all of your knowledge to literally create spaces and create cities and now create books. I just love that. I think it's so multidimensional. And what do your kids think about your new book, Dinosaurs to Dragons?
Oh, they really have been along for the ride. Very much so. Because when I started out, I didn't even think about nonfiction because I was writing so much business text at work. I thought, I want to write stories. I want to invent stories. And so my first books were stories, the Hector Fuller series, little chapter books series, and then a couple of other picture books over the years. And I was still working and I was raising kids. And so it was a lot. It's just a very, very busy schedule. Then I decided that I should focus. Like either I should focus on my job or I should focus on writing. And I really wanted to write. So I quit my job about 7 years ago and decided to write nonfiction because I realized that what I love is the research process. I love the learning. I love to explore a new topic and then find a way to kind of take the poetry of words and let the muse kind of come and help me figure out how can I present this information and what would kids enjoy and what would kids find funny or how to engage their hearts and their minds. And so I just write nonfiction now, but I slip a little fiction in, and my kids have been very much part of that. They sort of roll their eyes at me sometimes. But then they also send me articles. Now that they're grown up, they're in their 30s now. And so they'll send me an article to like, something about Neanderthals or something. And I love that. I feel like, yeah, you guys are getting it. They're getting the itch to learn and be curious and kind of delve into what we're discovering about the world, about our deep time ancestors, about all the fantastic creatures of the world. So they've been part of it. And I think they're proud of me, although there is a good deal of eye rolling. And there's also, there's been many dinners that burned on the stove because I kind of, I was like, I'm just going to sit down for a minute and then, 45 minutes goes by and we have to order pizza.
So I think the eye rolling is just something that it's a critical part of this parent-child relationship. But the one thing that sticks with me is that they're 30 and they're still engaging you. And one of
Yeah.
the things I often talk about in the podcast is how you build these bonds through reading with your children, and these are really lifelong bonds because parents and kids will always have this bond associated with the stories that were shared at dinner time or in bed, at
Yeah.
bedtime when you're reading
Yeah.
aloud to them. And I love that they're still sending you interesting things that they have come across. And I think it just
Yes.
proves my point about this idea of reading aloud and reading with our children being something that really nurtures our relationship with them.
Yeah, I can't tell you how strongly I feel about that. But of course, you are a book dragon, so you understand the joy of sitting with your children and sharing a book without anything else. No flashing screens, no interpretation of some AI voice, nothing. Just you and the book reading Ferdinand the Bull or one of Beth Ferry's books or whatever it is. Doesn't have to be an older book. Just share that book with a baby. Even with we have two beautiful little granddaughters now, and just open a book and look at the pictures and let them babble on. It sets up their minds for learning, for understanding, for empathy, for curiosity. It sets that pattern that lasts their whole life, and I hope that parents won't lose that, won't park their kids behind an iPad.
Absolutely. And on the subject of dragons and book dragons, I think we
Yes.
have to talk about Dinosaurs to Dragons. And I told myself I am not going to do all the talking because I really can. I can go on and on about it. It's so good. I thank you so much for allowing me that advanced copy to read it and to share some of it with my kids. And I can tell, what I will say before I let you have the stage here is that this is going to be a book that every teacher, every parent, and every curious kid is going to want on their shelves. And like I said, I could go on and on, but I think the listeners would rather hear from the author herself. So tell us a bit about Dinosaurs to Dragons, your inspiration, what it's about, anything you want to share.
Well, I love your take on it. I would love for every kid to want to have it on their shelf or on the shelf of their local library or school library. That would make this author very happy. So the inspiration for this book, it goes so deep. I started this book about 10 years ago and have been working on it on and off for a long time. But really the roots go back to reading mythology with my mom, mostly when I was a child. She loved mythology and stories. And so I've always read a lot of mythology, mostly Western classical mythology, a little bit of, Nordic mythology. But I bought a book years ago at a library sale. I have it in my hands. It's a nondescript brown cover with little green dots, and it's called Mermaids and Mastodons. And it was written by someone named Richard Carrington, published in 1957. And it's a book of natural and unnatural history. So it's about how fossils may have inspired mythical creatures, including all the giants, the mermaids, the kraken, the sea serpents, the dragons. And I bought it for $1 and I put it on my shelf. And then some years later, I pulled it out and I got this chill up my spine. It's like, this would make such a great book for kids. And so I sat down and started to plot it out. And I did a lot of reading. I soon found the wonderful work of Adrienne Mayer, who's a historian. She was at that time, she was at Stanford as a visiting scholar. And one of her books is called The First Fossil Hunters: Dinosaurs, Mammoths, and Myth in Greek and Roman Times. So I got in touch with her, and she was very generous, and she invited me to come down and have lunch at Stanford, and we talked and talked and talked. And she's looked at the mythologies in Western European culture, but also elsewhere in the world, including North America. And she became kind of a main advisor for me on the project. I read it first as a picture book, and I looked at American Museum of Natural History, had an exhibit some years ago that's still a traveling exhibit about the mythical creatures and origins of mythical creatures. And so that was a great resource as well. It grew and grew, and it kind of took it to a workshop, a nonfiction writing workshop, and this young assistant editor took my critique. When you go to a workshop as an aspiring author, you can apply for a critique from an editor. And of course, what you want to hear is, oh, I love this book, I'm going to publish it. And you never hear that. You hear, this could have promise, or, you get these very qualified and very polite responses. But the editor I was supposed to talk to from Simon & Schuster was sick. And so I got this very junior person named Julia McCarthy. I still have the pages that she marked up. And she said, I want to acquire this book. And, they never say that, but she said it. So
That's
I thought
amazing.
that was fantastic. And then like 4 years later, she finally did. And she wanted me to expand it. I expanded it. It became a middle grade book. And I really pinned down, it was still a proposal. When you market a middle grade nonfiction book, if you have some track record, you can have it acquired on the basis of a proposal. So you write first 1 or 2 chapters, you write an outline, you write a synopsis. So she acquired it finally around 4 years ago, something like that. And I got the opportunity to write it. By that time, had a pretty good structure of three land animals, 3 water animals, 3 air, and then dragons. And I had 3 fantastic advisors. I had Adrienne Mayer, a historian. I have Gabe Santos, who is a paleontologist and science communicator and co-founder of Cosplay for Science, and also now the co-producer of PBS Eons, which is a fantastic video YouTube series that every kid should watch. Your kids would love it. It's all about Earth history and evolution and fantastic weird creatures. PBS Eons.
I'm making a note of that right now.
Yeah, I would really like it, especially your 9-year-old. And then my other advisor is Dr. Josh Miller, who's a professor of geology and paleontology at the University of Cincinnati. And he is the education director for the Society of Vertebrate Paleontology. And he has, of course, corrected my science. So helpful and accurate so that I don't say stupid things. And also gave me a lot of ideas for how to talk about the phoenix and combustion and what that means in terms of chemistry. I would never have thought of that, but he gave me some of those ideas. I had the 3 advisors, I had the structure, and then it was very important for me to have this structure because the topic is so giant and so no pun intended, but it is giant and it is wide ranging. So each chapter has the same structure. Each chapter starts out with a little fictional scene and a let's imagine scene. Let's imagine that you are in a canoe on a West African river and you're lost and you see this shape. It looks like a female shape. Maybe it's holding a baby and it kind of evokes the mermaid legend, possibly. It's not to say that actually happened, but here's a possibility for what might happen. Let's imagine. So we start with that. There's a little context for the scene, and then there's legends and lore about the mermaid. There's tracking down clues, which is what might be some of the animals that might have inspired the mermaid legend around the world, because it's a global legend that comes up in various different cultures. And then to be a mermaid, so that's the sort of science section of each chapter of what would it take for you, Natasha, to be a mermaid? If you would your skin need to be thicker to withstand being in water? How would you breathe? What would you eat? And then what would those adaptations mean? And you would actually end up looking kind of like a manatee. Isn't that interesting? So that's the structure of the book and the structure of each chapter.
It's absolutely fascinating. And, as you're talking to me about all the experts that assisted with the science, when you're putting this book together, it comes across. Let me just tell you that it really does come across. But the one thing that really, really stood out for me was actually your writing style, because, Dinosaurs to Dragons, it's quite an information heavy book. And it's not by any means a book that you're going to just read in 10 minutes. It's so jam-packed with science, with legend, with stories, both new and old. And, this could very well have been a super, super dry tome, which I've read plenty of. But your writing really holds the interest of the reader. It's funny in parts, it's conversational, and it really treats the reader as though they're on this journey of discovery with you, as opposed to someone on the outside being lectured to or just listening in. And one of the things I've found throughout my life, and now especially as a mom, is that human beings learn best through stories. Did you find it hard when you were putting this book together to strike that really delicate balance of ensuring all the information was in, all the science was in, but also in a way that's really accessible to everyone? And that's what I felt. I felt that the way it's told, it's so accessible to everyone, your youngest readers, and even adults who may not have a science background.
Yeah, thank you. I am deathly afraid of being boring. I'm terrified of being boring. And, you asked, like, what was the part that my kids played in my writing career, which is kind of a second career for me, right? I am always thinking of them, and I do think about the eye rolling. And my husband will say, he'll pick up a book. I say, "What do you think of this book?" And he'll look at it, and then if he doesn't like the book, he puts it aside and he picks up the next one. And what that means is, if we were to have read that book to our kids, they would have taken it out of our hands, put it aside, and reached for the next one. So there's
100%.
a moment of attention where you capture a child's interest, but you got to honor that and do your very, very, very best to sustain it and respect it and make the most of it, because it doesn't last forever. It's a moment. It's a magical moment. I'm writing here for a little bit older kids, and I'm trying to be, inviting and conversational, but I am like a dragon hoarding treasures. I am like a total information nerd gathering person. I love all these little tidbits. I just love it, like the biomechanics of flight. It's so cool. And I got to interview lots of different people. And then I had experts review each one of these chapters in a different subject areas. So I am a dragon with its jewels, with its treasure, and I can't bear to let them go. So in order to make that happen, I have to try to present them in the most interesting way possible. So it is a balancing act. My advisor, Gabriel Santos, really helped me find that tone, because at first my science-y sections were coming across like, you could never be a mermaid. Don't be stupid, right? And he said, don't use science like a hammer. You need to try to engage and invite and spur curiosity of kids that they may not become scientists, but we want them to learn about the world and the wonders of the natural world, the living world. And so I had to try to find that balance of, how do I present science inquiry and critical thinking, which is a big part of this. I didn't even know that term, critical thinking, when I wrote this book. Now I do. What I'm trying to do is get kids to be curious and get them to read more and learn more beyond this book, So he helped me find that tone of being more of an invitation rather than a judgment.
Oh, I love that. And it comes across. It really, really does come across. And, it makes me think about something one of my other favorite scientists, Richard Feynman, said, and I'm totally paraphrasing here. He said that if you can't explain a concept in a way that a young kid, a 5-year-old, can understand it, you probably don't understand it yourself. So, you said that you're a bit of an information hoarder. It comes across because you obviously have all this information, and therefore you're able to then distill it in a way that's accessible but still accurate. And I love that. On the subject of something you said about critical thinking, and I've just made a note here to not forget to ask you this, because as I read Dinosaurs to Dragons, I kept thinking that this book could not have come at a better time. We're in a very sticky era at the moment with the rise of artificial intelligence. And I keep finding myself having this discussion with my kids, about them questioning for themselves whether something is real. And your book, Dinosaurs to Dragons, continually asks the reader to think really deeply about why a certain myth or legend would have been born. What would ancient people have seen that resulted in them creating stories of griffin, for example? Or what would sailors have seen that made them imagine mermaids? What do we have at our fingertips today to analyze these old myths, these old stories? And it's doing something really important. It's asking children, it's asking adults to analyze, to look at the evidence. And I think that we could do a lot more with that sort of wonder and curiosity in classrooms today. And was that quite deliberate on your part? I mean, I know you said that you didn't really think about that critical thinking aspect going into the book, but do you see now like how it's such an important tool, and this book could so well be used in classrooms to actually get children to think critically, to question
Yeah.
basically whatever it is that they see.
Absolutely. And here I want to give a big shout out to my teacher guide, which was produced by the nonprofit educational group Generation Skeptic. Generation Skeptics is part of the Center for Inquiry, a nonprofit group for critical thinking and science learning that was co-founded by Carl Sagan and Isaac Asimov and others. And I've gotten to know them because of my friend Bertha Vasquez, who is a brilliant science teacher, now the education director at Center for Inquiry. She handles 3 of their initiatives: Generation Skeptics, Science Saves, and TIES, which is the Teacher Institute for Evolutionary Science. And I got to know her through TIES because my other books are really about evolution and origins of life. And we become friends, and she has adopted this book as part of Generation Skeptics and produced the most amazing teacher guide. But she has classroom activities, slides, resources, worksheets, tie-ins to standard educational curriculum. Just an incredible resource that lives on the Generation Skeptics website. And our hope is that teachers will find that and want to use the book. I think the idea being, here's this high interest topic and it's a browsable book. Like you said, you don't necessarily read it through. You might look at this, you might look at that, or you might read it through. Kids can kind of dip in and out as they see fit. But there's a lot of material there to hopefully appeal to a lot of different kids with different interests. And maybe along the way, they'll look at things more carefully. I was very careful to avoid sort of the topic of cryptids. There are other wonderful, wonderful books about cryptids, like Kelly Milner Hall's books and other books that get into that topic. But I'm not so much interested in creatures that we think might be alive today, Bigfoot, Loch Ness Monster. I'm really more interested in what are the deeper origins of legendary creatures that come up in different cultures. Why do we keep recreating these creatures in different places in different times? There's something about them that resonates with our human inclination to storytelling and how we make sense of the world. How do we take natural phenomena and make sense of it? We do it through stories.
Absolutely. And I just love that. And you did share some of the resources with me. And I'm glad that you brought up Generation Skeptics and explained a bit more about the organization, because I only heard about them once you shared that one link with me. And it's fascinating. And I think it's so needed. Kids' brains, they're just wired for wonder. And sometimes we almost beat that wonder out of them by taking away the joy and sometimes replacing that joy with bulleted lists in textbooks. And I just love the way that, you've presented this nonfiction almost like an adventure. So you've got classical maps, you've got questions that you're asking, things about, have you heard about the Silk Road? You're bringing in, like you said, biomechanics and explaining the science of flight. And then you've got actual pictures of artifacts and fossils coupled to the most gorgeous, really dynamic illustrations. And it makes
Isn't
for...
her art just
It's
blow your mind?
absolutely. You can't actually look away from it. You want to keep looking. It just draws you in. And it just
Yeah,
makes that
Violetta
really...
Encarnacion. Yeah, she's just the best.
It's brilliant. I think, your text and those illustrations really make this book something that really stands out. It's so immersive, and most of all, it's fun. And I loved hearing about those teaching resources, especially that they're not just used for science. They can be used for creative writing. They can be used for solving mysteries in various ways. If you're into paleontology, there's something there for you. But if you're into poetry and legends and art, there's something there for you. Interestingly, I was just talking to my kid about this, my 9-year-old, who's got this very logical mind, but then he also really loves the idea still of magic in the world. And so he's like, but mom, do you really want to not believe in XYZ, in
Mm-hmm.
unicorns or
Mm-hmm.
in the magic of mermaids. And I said to him, actually, knowing more about where these stories came from and the fact that, like you said, so many different cultures from around the world have similar stories, for me, knowing that actually brings more magic and more wonder into this life. And I think it just gave him so much more to think about, that yes, having a myth about a mermaid is beautiful, it's lovely, but understanding a bit more about how this myth was created, or how someone may have thought up these drawings or these mythical creatures, really does expand your idea of this world. And in my opinion, it can ignite even more wonder. So, yeah, it was actually such a fascinating discussion with him.
That's really interesting, Natasha. I love that you shared that with me, because the last thing I would want to do is quelch a child's sense of wonder. What I hope the book will do is allow them to love these creatures and love these stories, but also realize that they are stories. There are no mermaids, there is no Yeti, but we can still celebrate those fantastical beings, and we can write stories about them, and we can make movies about them, and we can use them as metaphors in our lives. And some cultures, to be honest, these creatures are very real. Like, I didn't write about the Sasquatch because that was not my story to tell. I found that out pretty quickly. I did a little bit of research and talked to a couple people, and finally I wrote back and said, I think this is not my story to tell. And they said, thank you.
Wow.
They don't want it to be analyzed. It's part of their world, and you got to respect that. You can't force your way into people's belief systems. You got to kind of say, here we have the legends. This is the history of it. This is what we know from modern science. But I'm not going to judge. I'm not going to judge you for your worldview and your spiritual world. I'm not going to go there. But, one of the things I loved about creating this book was the image search. So Violeta Encarnacion created the beautiful cover, the chapter openings, and spot art through the book. And all the other images I found in museum archives, in just researching through natural history collections, museum collections. And it took an enormous amount of time to line up all the image licensing credits. That was a big part of producing the book. But again, here I am, dragon, hoarding my treasures. I couldn't let any of them go. And when it came time to finally lay out the book, the designers at Simon & Schuster said, yeah, I think we use all of them. And I was kind of like, whoa, wait, all of them? And they used almost all the images that I had collected as choices. They wanted to just cram the pages full of imagery. And
I think that's lovely though, because sometimes a lot of kids and even adults don't often get the opportunity to engage in that way with certain images, whether it is artifacts from different cultures or fossils. Yeah, I think you've just allowed people to get closer to these really interesting things, which they would not necessarily have been able to do so unless you visited a particular museum or made a concerted effort to do the searches that you did. So thank you for that.
If you're ever curious or you can't sleep at night, you can look at my bibliography. It's linked to my website. It's a 29-page long bibliography, and it includes, I know it's ridiculous, it's embarrassing actually, and it's not even everything that I read. See, the dragon, I hadn't really thought about the hoarding thing, but until I talked to you, and I realized that's what I am. I'm a little dragon. One of the things it lists is most of the museums that I visited as part of the research for this book, and that's not to brag. That's just like, I am so lucky to have been able to go to these museums and peer at these objects and read the signs and talk to the curators and learn about what they have gathered, because I guess they're dragons too, right? They're gathering their wonders for us to
Absolutely.
share.
And I also love how you explained being respectful of certain cultures and certain beliefs, while also, being open-minded enough to understand that, there's certain things that we'll never fully understand. And we have this knowledge now. This is the science we have today to to try and unpack certain things. And there's certain things that we just leave for someone else to maybe discuss or unpack or not if they don't want to. But I was actually talking to my husband about this, that science just changes so much because new discoveries are continually being made. In fact, we were laughing at what we believed about dinosaurs growing up and how much that has changed in the years. But as a writer of nonfiction, narrative nonfiction, etc., does that ever feel daunting that, what we've got, the information we have now may change because science is just so dynamic? Do you feel daunted by that?
Well, yeah, and that is the nature of science. Science is a process. It's not a set of facts, right? You know that as a scientist. And I think sometimes it is the biggest challenge is to get people to understand that, to get people to understand that science is not fixed. It's actually dynamic. It builds on itself and it is ever changing. And that is what it should be. That's the nature of it. And that's why it's potent and true. Because as we uncover new things, we should look back and reconsider what we thought before. I have a book coming out next year, actually with Bertha Vasquez at the Center for Inquiry. It stems from their Science Saves initiative. She created a video for Science Saves that looks at the outcomes of children's health from 1800, when just a little bit more than half of children in the United States survived past their 5th birthday. Think about that. Half. And up to now. And she followed this graph of survivability, and she created a video with this little ghost. It's really a great video, little ghost going through a graveyard. And she said, "Hey, what do you think of my video?" And I said, "Well, I want to write you a little book. I'll just write it and give it to you." And so we talked, and it kind of grew on me. And my father was a medical research scientist. And then we have this climate in the United States, as you know, very unfortunate anti-science, anti-health science in particular, happening right now. And then my dad at age 103 finally left us. And so I was pretty wound up about losing my dad and then what's happening in our leadership. And so I said, look, we're going to write this and we're going to publish this book. And my husband said, "You are never going to sell this book. You should write it because we need to write this proposal, but you are never going to sell this one." And then we did. It was picked up by Lerner Publishing Group, which is fantastic. We have a wonderful editor, and it's coming out in fall of 2027. And it's called Germ Wars: When Diseases Ruled and Science Fought Back. And it follows that history from 1800 up to now. And it shows the kind of battlegrounds of disease, cholera, typhoid, what caused them, what were the initiatives in public health and medical science that improved survivability of children through time until now.
That sounds amazing.
Ending with it's really we're just in final edits right now, so it's coming out. It's been announced, so I can talk about it. So there's a case of science building on science. In 1800, there's no germ theory. We don't know how diseases are spread and why they affect us. Building on germ theory, we start to develop more public health measures. We realize that you got to separate the icky water from the drinking water. Just basic stuff like that we take for granted, and
100%.
The rise of antibiotics and vaccines and so forth. So there's a case of how science builds on science.
I'm really looking forward to that. My kids and I, we have a few science-y type books all about bacteria and about one was about the creation of the smallpox vaccine, just kids' picture books, but they're just so fascinated, and so am I. And this sounds amazing, to have it told. That's very relatable for kids as well. You know what? There were children that didn't live past 5 years old. How is that possible? And I think this is going to be fascinating.
So I think it's a little grim, it's a little scary. So I tried to make it conversational as much as I could. But each of the chapters starts with a little fictional scene, like it's your birthday.
Yeah.
And you wanted your cousins to come, but they can't come because they just succumbed to measles or something, whatever it was.
Yeah, and I think that kids also, we sometimes underestimate their ability to grasp difficult concepts like things that are grim, like death and illness, and their ability to actually understand scientists. I always say that little kids, they're probably the greatest scientists because they have so much of
Yeah.
curiosity and are constantly asking why.
Yeah, absolutely. They're natural born scientists. They want to poke and test, and they want to know what causes what, cause and effect. It's great. It's
Exactly. Yes,
great.
they want to drop their food on the floor and test gravity. It's brilliant, actually.
Yeah, the classic Papa Fetch.
Yes. And just talking about that, children that ask why. So many of your books, like Out of the Blue, and I haven't had access to these, and they're all books that I'm definitely going to have to read because they sound fascinating, because I've just read a bit about them. The Oddball Book of Armadillos, the Upside Down Book of Sloths, and they feature animals, they feature evolution, and tell me something. Do you remember the first moment as a child when you realized that the earth had this incredibly deep history? Were you the sort of child who asked why constantly? Or do you think your curiosity developed later as you witnessed your parents and their scientific inquiry and your mom's storytelling, etc.?
That's a great question. I think I was not as interested in paleontology and deep time as a child. I was very interested in the life around us and learning about ecosystems and birds and oceans. I grew up on the ocean, and so I was very, very interested in biology and natural history. And then it wasn't until really I got to college, maybe I did have Stephen Jay Gould as my advisor, so you really can't avoid some influence there. And my freshman year, I actually worked. I had a job at what was then the Museum of Comparative Zoology, which I think is now called the Natural History Museum at Harvard. I would go around and make labels for the different collections, and there you have, these whale skeletons floating over your head, and you have lots of examples of prehistoric life in the collections. But I think maybe it was then my 18-year-old, 19-year-old brain caught fire for the wonders of life in the past and how bizarre and strange and different and fantastic they were. They were alien sort of shapes and animals. They were gigantic. Some of them were enormous. So that instilled that love of prehistory for me. And then I also loved the art museums and how people tried to make sense of Earth history and the world around them. I was very fascinated with geomorphology and the history of science, of how we explain the surface of the earth, which is really the key to understanding deep time, of course. How long does it take to carve a river? How long does it take for a mountain to rise or be worn down? That's how people figured out that the world is a lot older than they had been taught in kind of religious teachings. That captured my imagination. But then I got to have this 35-year sidetrack into urban planning. And then it kind of came back to it.
I think geology is just something that has its own magic associated with it. This episode, I'm going to be publishing as part of a series of episodes all about science and reading, bringing back that joy of science to children, because I have a feeling that sometimes school or traditional schools can really beat it out of kids, unfortunately. And I'm seeing it happen.
Yeah.
And I just want to be able to spark that joy again. And, a lot of parents who I've been chatting to often tell me that they're quite intimidated by science. If they're reading Dinosaurs to Dragons or any one of your books with their child, what would you say to them to reassure them that they too can nurture scientific thinking without having to necessarily go that bulleted textbook route, that it's not something that should fill them with fear, but instead with wonder?
Wow, that's a great question. I would say, as an author, I don't consider myself a scientist, but I think of myself as a student of science. And that's different. I am discovering these things so that I can bring them to readers. I'm not talking from a position of being an expert. I'm not trying to talk down to anyone. I'm trying to bring people along on the journey of discovery. So you don't need to be a scientist to learn about the wonders of the world, I think it's more important to just be curious. So come with me on this journey. Think about how armadillos of today are different and the same as their prehistoric ancestors. Why did that happen? Let's ask some questions. Let's look at it. Let's have fun. Let's celebrate the screaming hairy armadillo because it's hilarious and it's fantastic. And what a great name. And let's play with the words and let's play with the ideas. And you don't have to memorize anything. I think that's part of it. People think of science like, oh, I got to memorize the Krebs cycle, or I got to learn the periodic table of elements or organic chemistry, or those kind of heavy things that feel like a lot. You don't. You can leave that. You can do that if you want to, but you don't have to. You can instead enjoy these little gateways in, and maybe the phoenix and what happens to a phoenix chemically when it combusts is a little gateway to understanding combustion. Or maybe the Quetzalcoatl or the dragon is a gateway to understanding the biomechanics of flight, because we can look at how pterosaurs might have flown. How did they lift those enormous bodies off the gravitational field, right? How did they break the bonds of gravity? So I'm trying to set up these little gateways and say, come on, let's look at a picture, let's look at a turn of phrase and discover something new.
I love that. And I think you hit the nail right on the head there, that it's literally all you need is curiosity. You mentioned that you don't see yourself as a scientist, more as a student of science. And I think that the greatest scientists of our time would still consider themselves students of science, because you're continuously learning. There's so much to learn out there that you'll never really know everything. Yeah. So thank you for that. And I like the idea of a gateway. Let the pages, let these stories be a gateway to furthering our understanding of these broader concepts like biomechanics and the science of flight, for example.
I hope so. I really hope that kids will learn, and that dinosaurs, dragons, they'll celebrate them, and then some kids will go on and they'll make some D&D game platform like my son
Yes.
Sam, or they'll write a story, or maybe they'll write a fictional story. Another one might say, I really need to know more about flight, and get their flight chops going, get their biomechanics books and pursue that particular line of inquiry.
There's so many things to explore. I'm very well aware of the time, and so I just have to add in one kind of fun question, mostly because of your background, and because my husband asked me this the other day, and I was like, okay, I have to think this one through. If you could travel back to witness one moment in Earth's history or the history of the universe, where would you go?
Oh my goodness, wow.
I know, sorry, I'm putting you on the spot.
The podcast Paleo Nerd?
I don't know it.
Oh, check it out. Yeah, it's Ray Troll and his friend Dave. And Ray and I have a book out together, and we actually have another one coming out in 2028. And he and Dave do a really, really fun Paleo Nerd podcast, and they ask that question.
Oh, really?
Yeah. They interview, paleontologists and other similar professionals. So, where would I go back to? Well, in terms of the history of Earth, I might go back to the kind of middle Paleolithic. I'm very interested in human origins, and I have a couple books coming out on that topic over the next 2 or 3 years. So I would love to sort of meet some of our prehistoric cousins. We're the only human, like our species, Homo sapiens, is the only surviving member of the hominins. Of the Homo genus. We coexisted with Neanderthals and Denisovans and possibly other species that are kind of this ghost in the DNA that can be traced. So that would be super interesting. And then another period I think that would be very interesting is right after the KPG extinction, when the asteroid hit the Earth and kind of wiped out the big dinosaurs. The only dinosaurs that survived were the birds. Mm-hmm. That kind of reset the Earth, and we had the rise of the mammals and the rise of sea mammals like whales and dolphins, the cetaceans. So that would be pretty interesting just to sort of see how Earth was re-establishing itself. Life on Earth is resilient and has reset itself a few times. So I think that would be extremely interesting and also very dangerous.
I think so too. Very dangerous. But I imagine that, if we could go back in this fantasy, we'll be sort of protected in like a little bubble. Because I said to my husband that I want to go back to like the Big Bang and I want to know, like, I just want to see this.
Well, you would have a pretty good bubble there.
Indeed. So I have made a note of a few things that you mentioned, like Paleo Nerd, and I will link to these in the show notes. So anyone listening can also go have a look at these other books as well as podcasts that we spoke about. Elizabeth, thank you so much for joining us today. I've absolutely loved our chat. I've loved the reminder that science isn't just a subject we study, that it's a way of looking at the world. And books are just one of the best places for children to begin that journey. And I can't wait for everyone to have access to Dinosaurs to Dragons. And I know that it's going to be one of those fascinating books that people put back and take off the shelves over and over again. Thank you so much for being here.
Oh, thank you, Natasha. It's really a pleasure. Thank you for all you do, bringing books to families and children. It's great work.
Wow, bookish friends, I genuinely could have chatted with Elizabeth for another hour, but we both had to get on with our days, unfortunately. In fact, once we stopped recording, we found ourselves laughing about all the things we hadn't managed to cover, including one very important topic, tea. As it turns out, Elizabeth keeps a big pot of tea brewing throughout the day while she writes and researches, so I think she fits into the Tea Tales and Tomes family rather perfectly. So by the time you're listening to this episode, Dinosaurs to Dragons will officially have launched. If you have a child who is endlessly asking questions, who loves dinosaur science, myths, folklore, or legendary creatures, I think they're going to find so much to enjoy in this beautifully crafted book. It honestly is a wonderful reminder that science and imagination aren't opposites. They've inspired one another for centuries. You'll find links in the show notes to all the books, websites, podcasts, and resources Elizabeth mentioned during our conversation. You can also follow her on Instagram at Shreeve Books. You can also follow Elizabeth on Instagram at Shreeve Books. And if you already follow me, keep an eye on my Instagram over the next few days where I'll be sharing more from our conversation and look at Elizabeth's wonderful backlist and plenty more bookish and science-filled inspiration. Next time on Tea Tales and Test Tubes, we're exploring one of my favorite topics, how to put a STEM lens on almost any book you read. The truth is, bookish friends, you don't need shelves overflowing with science books to raise curious children. Some of the richest opportunities for scientific thinking are already sitting on your bookshelf. You just need to know how to look for them. Thank you so much for spending time with Elizabeth and I today. Until next time, keep reading, keep wondering, and remember, every great scientific discovery begins with someone who was curious enough to ask, I wonder why.